Welcome, everyone. I am Rachel Sengers from the Baltimore Rotterdam Sister City Committee, and I want to welcome you to our webinar called Reinventing the Industrial Legacy City. Today's lecture is by Klaus Philipsen, an architect and urban planner based in Baltimore, and he will talk about industrial legacy cities that are struggling to redefine themselves in a post-industrial world, using Baltimore as a case study. We have almost 100 attendees in this live event, including architecture and urban design students from Baltimore in the United States and Rotterdam in the Netherlands, architecture firms, planners, and other attendees from both Maryland and the Netherlands, and other visitors from around the world. So welcome. In today's webinar, we will have some introductory remarks, first by me, then by Rowan Petersma from the Rotterdam Academy of Architecture and Urban Design, then Christina Murphy from Morgan State University School of Architecture and Planning in Baltimore, then the lecture by Klaus Philipsen. After that, there will be a panel discussion and Q&A with all the people that I just mentioned, plus also Thijs van Spaandonk, Dean of Urban Planning at the Rotterdam Academy, Jeremiah Ekoya, graduate architecture student from Morgan State University, who's helping to coordinate today's webinar. Also, Magda Post from the Rotterdam Academy is also helping coordinate today's webinar. I am so very grateful to all of our panelists and hosts for participating in today's webinar. Before we start, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Baltimore Rotterdam Sister Cities. The relationship started in 1985. The mayors of both cities decided to become sister cities because both of them are port cities. And the port industries were moving away from the city center, and some of the industries were also moving overseas. And so the cities needed to reimagine the city's waterfront and their economy. At that time in the 1980s, Baltimore had just redeveloped its inner harbor to become a tourist destination. And Rotterdam wanted to learn some lessons from that. In the 1980s, it was not yet common to redevelop city waterfronts as recreational amenities. The Sister City relationship is managed by the Baltimore Rotterdam Sister City Committee. We are all volunteers. Our committee is based in Baltimore, and we also have some volunteers in the Netherlands who help us with our activities. We promote economic, cultural, educational, health, environmental, and other types of cooperation and exchanges between Baltimore and Rotterdam regions. In recent years, many of our projects have had an environmental sustainability theme. And thanks to our collaborations now with Morgan State University School of Architecture and Planning, we have also been focusing on architecture and urban design. We are part of Baltimore Sister Cities, and that's a nonprofit organization with committees that manage relationships with Baltimore Sister Cities around the world. Now, I will hand the microphone over to Rowan Petersma from the Rotterdam Academy, who helps coordinate the collaborations with Morgan State University School of Architecture and Planning. Thank you.
In 2019. And on behalf of the Academy, I would like to welcome all the, especially Rotterdam students that are attending this webinar now. And even more especially the students that will join the Studio Just Baltimore, the second edition that we will start this Friday. So a very welcome, especially to you as well. I hope you are all there. And I would like to add that I'm very happy with this lecture as a kind of kickoff for this studio. And I would already like to thank Klaus for his lecture that he's going to hold in a few minutes. And I want to thank Christina and Rachel for organizing this webinar, which is really great as a moment, especially for us when we start the new studio in Rotterdam. Our first studio in 2019, our location where we studied with the students was Pigtown. And for this edition, we will choose Pigtown as well. And we had a fantastic experience in that first edition of Just Baltimore. We had, of course, lots of studying in Baltimore, far away from, or in Rotterdam, far away from Baltimore. Then halfway the studio, we went on an excursion to Baltimore. The students were completely confused by what they saw there, rearranged their proposals. We had lots of exchange in Baltimore, which was very well done. The students went back to design, to research again. And well, it was for them a very intense and very rewarding experience. Of course, now with this studio, everything will be different. There is not a possibility to go there. So, well, we have to see how we do that. But it will be just as rewarding and intense for the students. I know for sure. And so this year, together with Wouter Veldhuis and Daryl Mulvihill and Deborah Schildmans, we as a team of teachers, we will try to guide the student in this second edition of Just Baltimore and look for searching and means to design a just city in Pigtown, because that's the topic of this studio as well. How can you design? How can you think about strategies for a kind of a justified city, a just city? And so our aim is to design really from out of research and from deep concern for the local community, defining the urgency for a just city, for the neighborhood, for Pigtown in this case. And students then will define their own program on the basis of their research, design an urban or social strategy, make a proposal, and finally design a public building in their urban setting for Pigtown. And what we experienced 2 years ago in the first edition of Just Baltimore is that we believe in studying on a topic far away from home. You do a studio, make designs for a completely different, not Dutch situation. And we saw with the students that results in a very free way of thinking, not biased, not knowing too much about the actual situation, really getting to know the situation from immediate research. And you see lots of very fantastic new way of thinking about problems in Baltimore, I think. So that was an eye-opener for us. So that's one of the reasons that we think that is very well and very good to repeat this studio now. It will be a fantastic learning experience for the students, leading to results that we will share with everyone in Baltimore. So we hope that we will be able to exchange all our ideas and the projects with you there in Baltimore, and of course with the MSU. And I hope we will have lots of possibilities for exchange, opportunities for exchange. And this lecture is a great start for that. Like I said, we will not have the possibility of having an excursion this year. So exchange with you all in Baltimore is more needed than ever. So I would like to end this short intro with a message for the Just Baltimore students that we will see on Friday for the first time. Lots of success with this studio, and we see each other Friday. And I hope you enjoy this evening as well. Thanks, and I think to you, Christina.
Thank you, Rowan, and thank you, Rachel, for this kickoff of the event. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Reinventing the Industrial Legacy City, Baltimore, by Klaus Philipsen. This marks the first series of a lecture series that will take place this spring. These lectures are occurring inside a very exciting and continuing collaboration with the Rotterdam Academy of Architecture and Morgan State University School of Architecture and Planning in Baltimore. I will like to welcome all students, faculty and staff from RAVD and MSU, committee members from the Baltimore Rotterdam Sister City, and our national and international friends for joining us this afternoon and evening. Before handing over the stage to our speaker, please allow me to briefly introduce Klaus to you. Klaus Philipsen is president of ArcPlan Incorporated, an architecture and urban design firm in Baltimore, specialized in community revitalization, adaptive reuse, historic preservation, and transportation projects since 1992. Philipsen writes on urban issues on his blog, Community Architect, and Community Architect Daily, and authored the book called Baltimore, Reinventing the Industrial Legacy City. He has taught architecture, urban design, and planning as an adjunct faculty at the University of Maryland and the Morgan State University. Klaus has previously participated and actively collaborated with Baltimore Rotterdam Sister City Committee. And now, to all attendees, I am inviting you to please put your questions for Klaus and the panelists into the Q&A option that you can find at the bottom of your screen. Your questions will be answered at the end of the lecture. Should any question not be answered during the length of this webinar, we will make sure to reach out to you and address your concerns later. Also, attendees, please type general comments into the chat window, but please be aware that Klaus and all the panelists might not be seeing them. At this point, all panelists, please turn off your video and audio if you have not done that so by now, with the exception of our speaker, of course, Klaus, of course. Klaus, please take it away.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Rachel, and all who set up this online lecture a year after it should have happened in person in Rotterdam. Since then, a lot has happened, and the future of cities, especially that of legacy cities, has become an even more urgent question. Good morning, good afternoon, and goedenavond. I'll not try this again. I know that the Dutch people are much better in speaking German than the other way around. But I understand you have winter storms. It's very cold and snowy, something that we had yesterday. So I'm glad you made it out anyway. Next. This is the forward in my book, The Industrial Legacy City, that is written by Alec Ross, who is a friend of mine, a resident of Baltimore, and who was gracious to write the forward. If you can read that yourself, I don't need to read it out. It describes very nicely the issue that we have, the topic that we have up today, on how an industrial legacy city goes through the various phases. And then just to be clear where we are, here is Baltimore, port city, and next to the capital, Washington, and then Rotterdam, just like Baltimore, next to the capital, The Hague, and also a port city. And then here are a few comparisons. Baltimore's port is much smaller. It's number 9 in the US. Rotterdam's is number 1 in the Netherlands and the top 10 in the world. The population of the two cities is about in the same order of magnitude with 600,000 plus people. Similar density. Also, Baltimore has a smaller land area. Baltimore was once an immigration entry port. Rotterdam has 51% foreign-born population. Baltimore has a much bigger airport than Rotterdam, and Rotterdam has a much bigger train station than Baltimore. Baltimore has a higher income average, but also a higher level of inequality in income. Baltimore has lots of attractive historic architecture, and Rotterdam is full of avant-garde modern architecture. Both cities have a strong industrial past, and both are affected by rising sea levels. The shift from agriculture to industry and from industry to services and from services to knowledge is never strictly sequential. Lots of these things happen parallel, nor does it come without tension, friction, and even violence. Hope and despair, destruction and glory seem to be always closely intertwined in my hometown of Baltimore. Baltimore is not alone in its pronounced urban ills. Located in the wealthiest state in the US, but with over 20% poverty rate, it is representative of many industrial Rust Belt cities. Glory and despair coincide and highlight the increasing inequities of the post-industrial society. I want to give you a very quick rundown visual tour of Baltimore that starts out with people. The shift from making to knowledge is also a shift from things towards people, with deep implications for how to shape the future city. The architect deals with people and with things and is very well positioned to eliminate this transition. So this will be 120 slides in less than 5 minutes, so hold on to your seats. Well, and while you have any kind of ideas, questions, impressions about these pictures, then please write them into the Q&A. So starting with people demonstrating in front of City Hall, enjoying themselves, going to school, installing funky art, and once in a while breaking out into unrest, as here in 2015 after the death of Freddie Gray in the hands of police. They enjoy public markets, eat in food halls, from food trucks, make music, beg at street corners, protest for more transit, drink microbrew beer, enjoy the flower mart, demonstrate against Trump, ride bike, play in water, do Zumba in the street, shop from horse carts, and under COVID, eat out in parking spaces. Water is the reason for Baltimore's existence. Its immigration, its attraction to visitors and residents, and it is also a threat from climate change. Baltimore's industry, once entirely carbon-based, shifted to food, trade, sports clothing, robotics, and back to small-scale making. Historic architecture is a strong element of Baltimore, from the first ever Washington Monument to some of the nation's oldest row houses, a basilica that made it on a postage stamp in the US, many other churches, old corporate headquarters, institutions, even a historic jail, old everyday architecture, and icons of modernism, which are now historic. Abandonment caused by deindustrialization, some of it industrial, some of it residential, some retail, or transportation, and lots of demolition. The fabric of Baltimore is a city of row houses and tall buildings downtown, with a few apartment buildings and more row houses, more row houses, more row houses, in all shapes and forms, even modern ones. city of steeples and monuments, bridges, and increasingly housing in downtown, in shiny towers or in new affordable housing. Adaptive reuse. In old bones, we find luxury hotels, condominiums, apartments, affordable housing, offices, and even a school. Anchor institutions teach art, law, business, architecture, we have a world-renowned symphony hall, and we have a world-renowned hospital. Our transportation went from being a smoky railroad city to a car-congested city with one high-speed rail line, 2 commuter rails, 1 light rail, and 1 subway line, and of course, many buses. We are now embracing scooters, bicycles, and water taxis. So after this whirlwind, let's dive a bit deeper into the past, the present, and the future of Baltimore. We will ask what got us here, listing the 5 biggest planning blunders, then transition to 5 successful strategies, and end with some speculations about the future, what in the DNA of the industrial legacy city may work to its advantage. First, the past. Unlike Rotterdam, Baltimore was bigger and more powerful in the past, but was it better? It had the first passenger railroad in the US, the first electric streetcar, the first gas streetlight, and the crown cork was invented here. But there were a few things that prevented Baltimore to achieve its full potential. Chiefly 2 reasons come to mind: that it sympathized in the Civil War with the Confederate South, which lost the Civil War, and that it embraced segregation and even invented the tool of restrictive covenants to maintain it. This shows success is not only bricks and mortar. Sometimes architects need to be reminded that that is not all there is to it. Nevertheless, physical things matter. Baltimore emerged based on its geospatial advantage as a protected port, its nearby tobacco fields, the first US passenger railroad, and many freight lines. Baltimore became the 2nd largest port of entry for immigrants from Europe. For a brief period around 1830, Baltimore was indeed the 2nd largest city in the US after New York. In the Industrial Revolution, Baltimore's industry included steel, textiles, sugar, spices, ships and automobiles, and airplanes. As a result, it became a magnet in the great migration of Blacks from the agricultural South. But when industry declined, the great migration continued, and a problem emerged: unemployment. I will now highlight what in the past did not work. And I start out with segregation and redlining. Redlining, shown on the left of the map, was a federal policy that started during the war and excluded certain parts of Baltimore from loans and thus from prosperity, mostly based on race. The resulting systemic disinvestment meant sinking real estate values, deteriorated schools, food deserts, and outright abandonment. Redlining hit industrial cities especially hard because of their large Black populations. Redlining and restrictive covenants excluded Black people from many new developments and locked them into place, while educated and upward mobile segments of the population would move to the suburbs. Today, the formerly redlined areas have high concentrations of poverty, as the map on the right shows, and poor health outcomes. And you can see that there are direct relations between the red line showing where investment was banned and the red areas where the poverty concentrations are high. The health outcomes today are such that the zip code has become more important for life expectancy than the gene code. Life expectancy in Baltimore can differ by 20 years within a single kilometer. The second failed planning policy was closely related to segregation, and that's suburban flight. The decline of the American city in the post-war period cannot be explained without the policies which lured to and excluded from the suburbs. The dominance of the automobile, the abundance of cheap energy, and the real estate tactics exploiting racial fears. The depleting of Baltimore is a direct result of policies favoring dispersal and sprawl. The suburban utopias of Frank Lloyd Wright and Ebenezer Howard and Corbusier's Ville Radieuse were responses to the urban ills of pollution and congestion, but they also fueled anti-urban sprawl, separation of people and uses, favored private lots over public spaces, and building out over building up. US policies kept poor people inside cities and moved the affluent into the periphery. In Europe, it was often the reverse. The poor were exported to the banlieue. In the last 50 years, Maryland used more space for development than in the 250 years before. This is neither socially, nor economically, nor environmentally sustainable. Sprawl increases the carbon footprint and makes communities less resilient. Today, Baltimore is still a shrinking city in a growing region. While the city itself lost 1/3 of its residents since 1950, the region roughly doubled in population. The next failure in planning is the auto-centric city. The auto-centric city is a direct result of sprawl, of course, but it is also an international phenomenon. I'm not telling anybody anything new with that. As elsewhere, the ubiquitous streetcar system had been dismantled, lively city streets turned into one-way auto sewers, and an attempt was made to build freeways through the heart of Baltimore. However, the freeway plans galvanized citizens in Baltimore into the Baltimore freeway battles. Most urban freeways were thus defeated, except for the Jones Falls Expressway, covering the Jones Falls River and a 2-kilometer fragment of the highway to nowhere that you see on the slide, also a product of the infamous Robert Moses, who was otherwise mostly active in New York. The African-American communities in West Baltimore were gravely wounded by this freeway. That highway is now a symbol of failed urban policies, and West Baltimore remains the scene of disinvestment, violence, unrest, and the locale for the TV series such as The Wire. 50 years after the Wooners became common in the Netherlands, the emphasis on getting commuters back into the suburbs as quickly as possible is hard to get out of the minds of US traffic engineers. As a result, transportation is the largest contributor of carbon emissions in the US. Urban renewal is another one that I put in under the failures, although one can certainly argue with all of those points. Urban renewal was born from the desire of the city of being competitive with the suburbs. Its medicine was lots of parking, slum clearance, and demolition, superblocks, and big office towers. Today, most planners in the US see large-scale urban renewal more as a disease than a cure. In some American cities, urban renewal did what bombers did in Europe. Luckily, Baltimore's urban renewal was modest compared to that of other US legacy cities such as Rochester or New Haven. But it left some scars to this day. Superblocks and new large office towers may have slowed corporate departures, but it did ultimately not prevent their demise. A now deceased mentor of mine, though, was in charge of early Baltimore renewal efforts, such as the Inner Harbor. And when he was retired, he cautioned me not to judge what was done then with today's metrics. That's a good lesson. Maybe he would really not like it that I put it under failure here. Baltimore's urban renewal gave us also some monuments of architectural modernism. One you saw, the Mies van der Rohe Tower, and one from Ian Pei, the World Trade Center. Urban renewal also gave Baltimore its famous Inner Harbor. Converted from commerce to fun, the reinvented harbor spurred a renaissance for Baltimore and gave the world a blueprint how to enjoy an urban waterfront instead of turning its back to it. And we will come back to the city of fun in a little bit. Another failure was public housing in high-rises. Baltimore's public housing was urban renewal under the label slum removal. Many people were displaced. The Baltimore Housing Authority was formed in 1937. The first social housing project in 1940 replaced 315 demolished slum row houses with 300 simple walk-up flats placed in strict rows and facing away from the street. After World War II, the number of public housing units swelled eventually to 18,000, now with high-rise projects intended to bring light and air and modern living to the masses, similar to what Corbusier had envisioned in Vie Radieuse. When the residents were working-class families, the towers actually worked initially as intended, but in deindustrialization, the high-rise apartments were no match. The working class in them was replaced by tenants of last resort, elderly, unemployed, teenage single mothers. Living in the high-rises became a nightmare. Eventually, almost all public housing became less desirable, even the low-rises. The fate of Baltimore's public housing high-rises tracked that of similar projects in Chicago and St. Louis. Starting in the 1990s, all those projects were imploded as failures. Today, Baltimore Housing continues the process of replacing now their low-rise buildings into mixed-use, mixed-income, street-facing development that was originally demolished. Once again, the poor results stemmed from a combination of how investments are distributed and how opportunities are assigned. Social change in architecture planning. Social change was really trumping architecture intention. Now we're moving on to the present, and now I'm moving from failure to what are tentative successes, enduring practices. I will list again 5. The first one is preservation. And it is kind of ironic that the first successful strategy of reinventing the city is preservation. But preservation not only has stabilizing cultural and social effects, it turns out it is good economic development. And it is often more sustainable than new construction. Baltimore has more locally designated historic districts and buildings that are listed in the National Register District than any other US city except Boston. With 72% of Baltimore, Baltimore has nationally the highest US number of buildings built before 1945. Many old buildings are still standing because of the freeway plans were defeated. It turns out old buildings attract immigrants, the creative class, and millennials. Our best and most successful neighborhoods are the historic neighborhoods. But once again, great architectural bones don't guarantee success. Many of the same type beautiful houses stand abandoned in the former red light neighborhoods. A subset of preservation is adaptive reuse. That's a form of preservation where the old buildings are used for a totally new purpose, such as housing in an old factory, a brew pub in a historic church, a movie house in an old trolley barn. And I also lump into adaptive reuse the reuse of brownfields. In fact, the incredible array of creative and successful adaptive reuse projects is one of Baltimore's best architectural secrets. When I toured the city with a German architecture professor before COVID hit, she was floored how much high quality adaptive reuse we have. The industrial brownfield reclamation is part of this preservation troika. It too saves embedded energy and allows growth in already built up areas. Brownfield redevelopment is good urban renewal without displacement. Baltimore's thriving downtown extensions are all built on former industrial brownfields. So reinvention doesn't always mean new construction. Using the good bones of an old industrial legacy city is a successful and sustainable strategy. Then next success strategy or strategy with some debate is meds and eds. Reinvention needs new, clean, and prospering industries. In Baltimore and many other legacy cities, higher education and healthcare are the new engines. Using them to pull up distressed neighborhoods is a strategy also called working from strengths. It is not undisputed because it's a triage strategy. Hitching investment to a strong anchor versus putting the money where the biggest needs are. Baltimore has oscillated between these two poles, between need-based investment and strategic reinvestment based on anchors. Limited resources ultimately force the city to embrace building from strengths in its current planning. Investment needs a backstop so it can create a ladder effect in which properties that are far below market value slowly step up, needing less and less subsidy for redevelopment. Need-based investment is morally superior, but without anchors, the money disappears like in a barrel without a bottom. In an attempt to balance success and ethics, Baltimore City Planning has strategically designated investment target areas, but also engaged in scrubbing the capital budget of all city departments for equity. Then comes the issue of the creative class. Education and medical institutions as engines brought about the term of the creative class as the group most likely to help cities to move forward in it. Baltimore never made it its explicit goal to attract the creative class, except maybe for private developers such as this vision of the year 2000 on the slide, which wanted to turn the old harbor into a digital harbor. This concept evaporated when the dot-com bubble burst, which shows, the future comes sometimes different than one thinks. Still, the truth is that new residents coming to Baltimore in recent years have been largely young professionals and artists moving to waterfront communities, repurposed loft buildings, working or studying in Baltimore's eds and meds institutions, while enjoying low real estate and great architecture. Unfortunately, the outflow of poorer residents has outnumbered the inflow. Even though newcomers rarely displaced existing residents, Baltimore isn't spared the debate about gentrification, which gives the creative class a bad name. Fact is, the reinvented legacy city needs young people with the right education for the new prospering industries. And then the city as entertainment, as I mentioned already. As this slide shows, Baltimore's famous developer, the late Jim Rouse, declared already in the 1970s on the title of Time magazine that cities are fun. Urban tourism has even more critics than attracting the creative class. The British town planner Peter Hall wrote in his textbook, Cities of Tomorrow, the Rouseification of Boston and Baltimore, a process to be repeated in a score of older American industrial cities, thus involves the deliberate creation of the city as a stage. Like theater, it resembles real life, but it is not urban life as it ever actually was. So yeah, the critical voice is right here. Baltimore mayors began chasing tourist dollars only after it was discovered that the Inner Harbor, which was originally intended for the residents, could actually attract visitors. The focus on attractions and events around the Inner Harbor brought a series of grand projects, including an extension of the National Aquarium, a baseball stadium, a doubling of Baltimore's convention center, a new football stadium, 2 city-subsidized convention center hotel projects, and most recently a casino that funnels revenue into city coffers. Next in line, big cash for an ailing horse race park to save the famous Baltimore Preakness. There is much doubt that these projects ever pay for themselves. Nevertheless, they are important elements in the competitiveness and psychology of a legacy city, definitely when it comes to baseball and football. And so I put them here in the success column anyway. Equity, awareness, and the vast needs of a disenfranchised population for jobs and services are reasons to question a strategy that is too focused on entertainment and tourists. The prevailing mood is to make the city better for those who already live here. This leads to our last success strategy, the livable city. Baltimore is known as a city of neighborhoods. This last reinvention strategy is probably the strongest because it combines all previous strategies and connects them to one goal, to offer a livable community for new and existing residents by rebuilding neighborhoods, fixing parks, improving transit, creating bike and scooter lanes, and making sure that there are fewer food and service deserts. In short, making the quality of life better across the board is a precondition for a healthy and sustainable city. Keeping residents from moving away and making them proud of their own town requires that schools work, police is fair, and the trash is being picked up. The basic stuff. Vast discrepancies between rich and poor are not sustainable. The COVID pandemic has made this point even clearer. A small example is when the city, as the owner of streets, changes streets into places of livability, known as complete streets, and particularly popular now under COVID for additional outdoor eating. Another example is Baltimore City's collaboration with the state-run regional transit agency to create faster bus service through miles of dedicated bus lanes and traffic signal priority. So with that, the last segment of this presentation that deals with the future. Good planning means that the future has to be shaped or not just be waited for. Strengths of the past need to be leveraged, and rapid change and unexpected need to be anticipated. I will pick 5 topics which are a mix of forecast and speculation: geopolitics, climate change, making and the future of work, autonomous vehicles, and the gig economy. Starting out with geography and geopolitics. Based on its location, the Brookings Institution included the Baltimore Metro in a list of only 19 global knowledge capitals in 2016. Its location is still strategically viable as it was on this railroad map of the past, and it is part of its DNA. It isn't clear whether knowledge will continue to accumulate in cities and whether global cities will continue to grow Or as the Dutch architect Rem Koolhaas stipulates in his book and Guggenheim exhibit Countryside, it will be the countryside that will decide the future. Climate change is a large force in this question. Baltimore and Rotterdam's places are as global ports with the national capital right next door is and will be a great asset for the reinvention of the industrial legacy city, even more so because the importance of nation states will likely continue to shrink. A renaissance of nationalism or renaissance of rural spaces notwithstanding. Cities will be leaders in the adaptation against climate change, and climate change will also make it more important again where a city is located. Climate change and resilience. Cities are the leading consumers of energy and the primary source of greenhouse gases, but compared to suburban dispersal, they are more energy efficient, have smaller carbon footprint per person, and location matters. Cities that rely on massive irrigation because they sit in a desert like Las Vegas, Phoenix, Dubai, and others, or will be too hot without extreme air conditioning, will have a hard time to be low emitters or to be resilient. So will cities that are located right in the path of hurricanes on low-lying former swamps such as Miami. But tackling climate change will require more than a good location. It will need reinventing the system of production, transportation, and distribution. The industrial legacy city has reinvented these sectors before, and it is better prepared to do it again. Compared to newer cities that rely mostly on freeways for transportation, for example, or compared to new towns, which represent only a planning philosophy, one single planning philosophy, such as the huge mega cities in China, where everything is of the same age. The future city must be a livable and authentic home, a place where people not only work, live, and prepare food in an efficient and compact manner, but also where they like to be. Baltimore has the bones for energy efficiency and resilience. People used to make things will have an advantage when local production will have a renaissance. There will be plenty of jobs in the green economy that still requires making things. Those can't be easily filled with the retirees of Miami Beach, the movie makers of Hollywood, or the financial acrobats of New York. Baltimore consists of mostly solid buildings, has plenty of water, and will continue to have a tolerable and varied climate, even when extremes will be more extreme, as this particular slide on the left shows. To be prepared, Baltimore has drafted ambitious strategic climate resilience and sustainability plans. Now they must be enacted. I will next touch on two technologies that can help the industrial legacy city. First, about making. In a world of energy saving and efficiency, the division of labor where entire countries or cities are just about knowledge and others are just about food or production will prove to be wrong. Even in an interconnected world, local production of food and durable goods will be necessary for social, economic, and environmental reasons. Some emerging technologies will advance local production. For example, durable goods and 3D printing. 3D printing is dismissed by many as more hype than substance. True, its usefulness is still emerging. When personal computers came out a mere 40 years or so ago, many people also asked, for what are they good? Just consider this. If custom production instead of serial production becomes an alternative way of making things, the need for concentration of capital and the loss of the economy of scale will lose weight. If making doesn't cost much more than a 3D printer and some spools of materials, the importance of bankers and financiers will diminish. They have shaped our cities for the last 30 years or so. If everybody can be a producer, the shape of cities will change again. Goodbye assembly line, goodbye factory floor, and maybe even goodbye large corporations and merger mania. Big wouldn't be needed anymore. Decentralized local making could be a second chance for those who have been shut out from production during deindustrialization. When making things in our own four walls becomes as commonplace as consulting, working from home, or document printing from home, drastic social, political, and physical changes are certain. Based on the time it took to get from the Atari computer to the iPhone, there won't be very much time to plan for this future. If people are once again not only consumers, but also makers, city will look different than in the world of a 9-to-5 commuter. The future city will be mixed use. A city with mixed use in its DNA will have an advantage. Unfortunately, there is no guarantee that things go the way I describe it here. The current knowledge industry certainly shows no sign that concentration and mergers are obsolete. I talked about production of durable goods, same for food production. The Dutch have already demonstrated how growing massive quantities of food close to urban centers work. Hydroponic urban agriculture can bring food closer to the growing urban population. Greenhouses can, on vacant lots in Baltimore Sandtown, as shown here on this slide, are just a simple beginning. Additional opportunities are vertical farming integrated into facades of net zero buildings, food production on roofs, or in repurposed distribution warehouses, and the trend to replace animal meat with plant-based or engineered meat. This all could significantly reduce the well-established environmental burdens of current industrial farming, current construction methods, and the wastefulness of shipping and food halfway around the world, all at the same time. Another technology I want to mention is the self-driving automobile. It is sure that the autonomous vehicle will change cities dramatically. Will it be good or will it be bad? Again, different futures are possible. It can make traditional transportation failings even more dramatic through additional traffic and even more dispersal. If everyone who owns an auto today will have a self-driving car and then send that out to buy pizza. But it could also, with the right policies in place, and if AVs facilitate the insight that autos are a poor investment that sits idle more than 90% of the time, be a huge boost for dense cities like Baltimore with its relatively narrow streets. It could free up valuable space if rechargeable, emission-free vehicles used on a per-need base will prevail. They will provide mobility where current transit can't reach. Parking garages, gas stations, car dealer lots, and Baltimore's bits of freeways could find a higher and better use. The electric fleet AV could give ailing transit a new lease on life. What's not to like? The second version could be able to dethrone transportation from being the biggest carbon emitter in the US and also truly foster a city for people. Mobility via transit and fleet-based automatic vehicles could be the ultimate victory of Jane Jacobs over Robert Moses. And lastly, the gig economy. The future urban citizen may be foreshadowed in the current gig worker. Already the gig economy has provided entrepreneurial access to disadvantaged population groups. It is easy to engage and disengage, whether part-time, full-time, and regardless of skill level. The gig economy, the combination of other gig jobs with continued education or with family obligations is possible. As I described, the gig economy offers jobs which don't require a big factory or an office tower. This informal economy is more treacherous than the historic steel job at Bethlehem Steel with its union negotiated good wages, fixed work hours, benefits, and pensions. Uncertainty may be the price for a much lower entry threshold for flexibility and a less regulated life, which are the rewards. In a gig economy, things have to be mixed, close by, and flexible, just as in the many utopian communities imagined over the century, or just like in the industrial legacy city. Things may not turn out so rosy. For example, the gig economy jobs will likely be imperiled by robots and AI. In conclusion, I will give you a Ernst Bloch philosopher quote. Quote, humanity lives everywhere still in prehistory. Indeed, each and everything is waiting for the creation of a just world. The true genesis is not at the beginning, but at the end. And it will only start to come about when society and existence become radical, i.e. take themselves by their own roots. End of quote. Whether geopolitics, making autonomous vehicles, or gig work, the industrial legacy has a leg up. There is no good reason why it should not shine again in a new and different way. But other futures are also possible. Good planning, good policies, and risk-taking are needed to unpack the possibilities. That you are attending this session shows that you care. And thank you, and I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Klaus, for this insightful presentation. Now, if you can kindly stop screen sharing, thank you very much. All the attendees are invited to add your questions and in the Q&A window for Klaus and all the other panelists to provide with answers. Once again, you should any question not be addressed at this time during this webinar, we will make sure to address them separately via email. All panelists, very good. Please turn your audio and video and stop streaming the screen. Thank you, Klaus. Guys, at this point, I would like to invite you to open up the discussion. Would you like to try to bridge, build up relationships between what was presented by Klaus about Baltimore and what you can see related to our current situation in Rotterdam for the sake of our joint studio and the listening audience? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Christina, and thank you so much, Klaus. I really enjoyed the lecture so far. As you can see, I'm not in front of a beautiful skyline of the city, but just in my living room. Somehow my computer doesn't let me have a background. So welcome in my living room. Yeah, what I think, I mean, hearing basically a very reduced and comprised history of the urban development of Baltimore, I see a lot of similarities. I mean, it's not a surprise that they're sister cities. So there are so many similarities with Rotterdam. Although I think that when you are speaking about the legacy city, I think in Rotterdam the legacy is actually still the present. We're still kind of like a port city in full swing. But we do know we need to think about what's next. And I do want to give, I think, some remarks on it. And one of the things that Rotterdam is very aware of, that the port actually moved out of the city, but only in the last 50 years. So I think until World War II, like 70 years ago, the city was very much, or the port was very much part of the city and really inside the city. Very visible, and also the labor of the related to the port was still in the city, but that moved out quickly after the Second World War, and now the port, which is still huge in terms of size and turnover and the turnover of materials, and liquids. It's became less and less labor intensive. So it's an automated port almost. So the question about what the role of labor is still in the port is a big question. And that's what Rotterdam is struggling with. So one of the things they're trying to reinvent is what's actually a labor intensive port city. And can we reinvent some kind of like making industry within the city itself again, that is close by, not depending on car traffic. The other thing that is interesting with Rotterdam, and that is still kind of a very relevant topic, is that it's while it's close to The Hague as the capital, the competition Rotterdam feels is more with Amsterdam, where Amsterdam is Amsterdam is the capital, but The Hague is the government capital. So we kind of made a distinction between it. But Amsterdam is kind of the city where a lot of young people actually start living, and Rotterdam was struggling with keeping the students. It has a very big and very respected university, actually. It had a lot of difficulties keeping the students in the city after they graduated. So keeping the young or higher middle class people in the city. And they invented a lot of money in actually providing houses, public functions, programs for this particular group of people, and they succeeded. But now it's kind of passing into the stage of gentrification within like 10 years. So from having difficulties bonding these people to becoming unaffordable as a city to live almost. And I think what's interesting, and that's kind of the topic also what the studio is going to be about, and also a position that we as an Academy of Architecture and Urbanism trying to take, how can we use our design instruments to explore how we can, think about these, what's the role of designers? Where's our position? Where do we position ourselves within these contexts? And for Rotterdam, and I think also for Baltimore, and that's what I think you closed off with, is the climate topic. And for Rotterdam, that's a very diverse topic. It's related to the city or the port, actually, depending on, it's a fossil fuel port. It's an oil port and a gas port. So it's less about goods, it's very much about oil and energy. So we have to move away from it. Rotterdam is one of the lowest lying cities of the Netherlands, so it's large part of the city are actually underwater or on the sea level. It's one of the most polluted cities of the Netherlands, but also because of its population build up. The term climate inequality, I think, also very much applies to Rotterdam, and that's something we really need to think about. So how can you make sure climate inequality doesn't become the next big challenge in the city? And I think that's very much related to the studio that Rowan and Christina and Wouter are going to point out also. It's about, so how can we design for the city? How can we do interventions that deal with this topic of inequality, and how can we solve it? How can we build a public infrastructure? And I think that's also very much what I took from your lecture, that the importance to really, look at the latest point you made, the city that is for everybody, where really think about good public space, public amenities. So I think it's a very interesting story to hear that Baltimore already explored a lot of these topics that Rotterdam is still kind of in a condensed ways struggling with. So yeah, I really look forward to keep this exchange going also in that regards. Yeah, I see there's also some questions on Rotterdam from your audience, so I would be very happy to answer them. But maybe some of the other questions first.
Yeah, I can start reading the questions.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So the first one is going to be directed at Klaus, and it states, do you have any idea of microclimate issues in Baltimore, such as urban heat island effects for the past years?
Yeah, the city is certainly aware of that in their sustainability plan and tree plantings and park regeneration and all those things are in there. What I'm missing, what Baltimore has not done much, and I don't think many US cities at all, is checking the airflows as they relate to pollution and to heat island effects. I practiced and lived in Stuttgart before, which was a city in like an inverse pot surrounded by mountains or hills rather. And they discovered that when you build architecture in a way that it blocks the natural airflow, you get a much stronger heat island effect, and you get also much less exchange of pollutants. I think that is something that Baltimore needs to study more, that can be done through thermographic imagery out of airplanes at night, where you see where the heat gets retained. But generally, it is understood, and it's an equity issue as well. You will find that the streets in the poorer neighborhoods are the ones that have, I mean, there's a reason why the posh neighborhoods are called the leafy neighborhoods, because they have a lot of trees and the poor neighborhoods don't. And there are large programs underway that try to address that.
Okay. And for Thijs, are there any equivalent to urban renewals in Rotterdam?
Yeah, I think the climate adaptation part. So I think it's part of basically every urban plan in Rotterdam now, or urban development plan now, where it's about greening, it's about reducing this urban heat island effect, but it's also about making the soil, treating the surface in such a way that it can actually absorb water, and so it doesn't flood the.
Yeah, if I could interject, I think that question is going back to the urban renewal of the 60s and 70s. As sort of the bad urban renewal that demolished a lot of the historic fabric.
Yeah, true. And in that sense, also the green in the city was not really taken into account. So especially after the Second World War, in the Second World War, part of the inner city of Rotterdam was demolished because of bombings by the Germans, and they really planned it, the city center for the cars. So it was a car accessible city center with large open spaces, fully paved, and now the current situation is to actually move away from that situation again. So to redesign street profiles, to green it, to take out the cars in some part, make it less accessible for cars. So we have to renovate the renovation, basically.
Okay, the next question is actually a transit question.
Yeah.
It states, I think one of Baltimore's greatest failure was the inability to build out the metro rail system as originally planned in the 1960s. Even today, the lack of comprehensive, high-capacity public transportation system continues to disadvantage Baltimore's relative to other cities, especially DC and Boston. How do you think Baltimore would be different today with a fully built subway system? And this is directed to Klaus.
Yeah, sure. It would be a different city. So I'm very jaded by the fact that I worked for 13 years on the Baltimore Red Line, and then it was killed by the governor, even though it was fully funded. And so I wasted 13 years of my life, and I really took Stuttgart, my previous hometown, as an example, where they reformed the streetcar system. They never abolished it, and they transformed it into a full-blown light rail system that in downtown runs in tunnels. And so they kept all the lines active and modernized this. And this would be akin to having a full rail system. And that was very much in dispute back when they built it. It was very expensive and very disruptive. But today you would not find a single person in Stuttgart, and there are many cities in Europe that did the same thing, that would say that was a bad idea. Everybody rides these trains, all walks of life sit in these trains, and they are vital to the economy. So Baltimore would be in that condition. However, the subway, as it was initially built in one line, was a baby of Johnson's Great Society ideas in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King and Kennedy, or of Kennedy first, and then it was too grandiose. It was too expensive, and Atlanta and Baltimore and San Francisco and Washington, of course, were the cities that got some of that kind of new subway system. In that sense, we are actually a step ahead of many other cities. But then it was expensive to continue it, and then making the light rail systems, which are more economical, more pervasive, and more often, that's where we really failed.
Okay. The next question states, I have been to Rotterdam and love it. The similarities between our cityscapes as port cities are apparent. Could it potentially be worthwhile to explore a direct flight connection between Baltimore and Rotterdam? And additionally, the Port Rotterdam offers guided boat tours of the port facilities, but the Port of Baltimore does not. This could be a good way to educate residents and tourists on our maritime heritage. How can we get such a program here in Baltimore?
I'll just briefly answer the question about the flights. There actually was, for a period of time, direct flight KLM from BWI to the Netherlands. And that was a long time ago. My understanding is that the Baltimore Rotterdam Committee at the time were instrumental in getting that to happen. But then it ended. So, and I don't know why it ended, but I suspect there wasn't enough traffic. They weren't making enough money off of it. But who knows in the future? But we do hope that flying will become more sustainable. And there are, there's some work being done on that in the Netherlands to make it more sustainable. But the benefit right now of doing these virtual visits, right, is we're not burning that much fossil fuels. So thank you for that question. And I don't know if somebody else wants to comment on the other parts of the question.
Well, making the harbor and the water more of an attraction in not having silly attractions on the edge of the water, but making the water itself an attraction is a peeve topic that I like to propose all the time. And that includes tour of the working harbor. Like in Rotterdam, our actual active port is, of course, moved from the shallower waters of the inner harbor out further, and it is hidden from the eyes of the general population. And when there is once in a while a tour, very few people participated in it. And I think it would be hugely helpful if more people would have an understanding what's going on in the Port of Baltimore.
Just to add a small anecdote to it, actually our academy is in an old shipyard, and to get there you actually have to go by boat. So there's a water bus connecting it to, so the trip to the academy is always crossing the harbor. It's a very unique experience.
Okay. So this question's based off of the transit question, and it states, what is Rotterdam's metro like, and what roles does Rotterdam metro system play into its success? It seems like the Baltimore and Rotterdam had a similar trajectory in that they started in the 1960s and grew slowly, but Baltimore was much slower and stopped by the cancellation of the Red Line. And this is directed at Thijs for Rotterdam Metro.
Yeah, I think Rotterdam has a few lines. I think 3 or 4, I'm not sure. One recently added, and it basically also used to connect the outlying suburbs or kind of satellite towns, you could say, to the city center. And the latest addition to it was a line from Rotterdam Central Station to The Hague Central Station. actually, so to connect multiple cities with one metro line. And I think it's functioning quite well. It's quite modern. It's actually well maintained. It works pretty well. But the issue that Rotterdam has now with its transit system is that it's connecting the different parts of the city to the center. So it's kind of like a radial system. And the current issue, especially the southern part of Rotterdam, it's more than half of Rotterdam actually lives in the southern part of Rotterdam. But that's a lot of people that live there that probably, for instance, have to travel to the harbor or have to travel somewhere else. But they cannot get there by using public transport, because the public transport is all about getting people to the city center and not in other directions. So Rotterdam is now thinking of having other connections like streetcars, like new streetcar connections, crossing the river at different locations. So it becomes more like a spread system, easier to change modes and also to get away from the car, because Rotterdam still very much is a car-based city, and a lot of the traffic also within the city is still by private car.
Klaus, would you like to add on to that?
No, I just looked at Martin's question there, and I think we could just pivot into that one, if you don't mind me interfering with you. But since it's also transit related, and it asks whether there is a relation between the poor parts of Baltimore and the accessibility by public transportation.
Okay, I can read it. Yeah, is there a clear relationship or relation between the poor parts of Baltimore and the accessibility by public transport? In Rotterdam, the south part of the city has a very limited access to public transport, and those parts of the city are known to be the poorest parts of the city.
So in Baltimore, the answer is more complicated, because it's not that the poorest parts of Baltimore don't have good public transportation in the sense of how many lines are available within a few minutes of where people live. What the poorest parts of the city show is that they have the longest trip times. And that is a bit more complicated to explain, because it has to do with where the jobs are. So Baltimore City is a big job magnet, but it has a lot of financial and service industry and insurance and what have you, office jobs. And a lot of the poor people in the poorer sections of town are relying on jobs that are far outside the city in job sprawl. And so to reach those destinations, they have to change transit 3 to 4 times, and that average trip time is only a very small portion of the city can reach their jobs within 45 minutes by transit, whereas almost 100% of everybody can reach jobs by car in 45 minutes. So in that sense, there is inequity in transit in Baltimore as well. And it would require, to solve this, that the jobs get more concentrated again, and that you can't chase every last job with transit unless you start to have demand-based transit, which is where this autonomous vehicle would come in, and fleet-based smaller versions of transit. And then the second thing is that the service that is offered needs to be more expeditious, that the high frequency of slow bus service in the poor neighborhoods isn't helping them if they have to go long distances.
Okay. The next question states, are there metropolitan area-wide policies and laws in Rotterdam, South Holland? For example, planning, transportation, housing, property, and income taxation, metro-wide income, integration, and education, from which Baltimore and Maryland could learn from. Arguably, the hyper concentration of poverty and abandonment and in Baltimore cannot be solved without regional metro-wide statewide policy changes to DICE?
It's a big question. No, but I think the anonymous attendee who actually stated the question is right, and also that's why Rotterdam works also on different levels. So I think when it's about public transport, and I just explained a bit about the metro connection to The Hague, it's part of more like a regional collaboration between Rotterdam and The Hague, which is also about the natural areas in between, the different kind of satellite towns that are in between. So on economic and mobility aspects, they're really collaborating in this way. When it comes to Rotterdam South, which it's south of the river, that's predominantly also the poorer part of the city, where a lot of issues related to socioeconomic struggles, accessibility of housing, unemployment, education are these issues are on such scale. I mean, within the context of the Netherlands, that there's actually a national program for this whole part of the town. There's the national program Rotterdam South that is about doing state investments and state programs into these neighborhoods to try to speed up the development, do urban interventions, think about educational programs. So there's a lot of these kind of programs, and they're actually state programs. If you want to more, well, again, I don't know who actually stated this question, but if you want to know more, there's a lot of information to be found. So I think that can be shared also.
Okay, the next question is directed at Klaus. It states, the light rail red line must be built through West Baltimore, and where did the Port of Baltimore go, and how big is it now?
Well, I agree with the red line. It should still be built. And maybe there is a day when that happens with a different governor. And of course, we have to line the funding up again. It's not going to be easy. The second question is, the Port of Baltimore is for the largest part still in the city of Baltimore, in the confines of the city. And, when you go out on the Key Bridge or so, you can see it. And it has a smaller portion of cargo that is containers, because Norfolk is the larger container port, and because containers are mostly about expediency, it is cheaper, easier to unload at the beginning of the Chesapeake Bay than to ship all the way to Baltimore. Although Baltimore has very large portal cranes that can do the containers now as well. Where Baltimore is near number one in the US is bulk cargo, which includes automobiles. So just like the Port of Rotterdam that thrives from petroleum, Baltimore thrives from the European automobiles for the whole east side of the country coming into the Port of Baltimore and other bulk goods. We are exporting John Deere and tractors and harvesting machines and things of that nature as bulk, and we are bringing in the automobiles. So that is very still a thriving port. It's very much a large employer and an important part of the Baltimore economy.
Okay, the next question states, I was attending last time a Chicago Strip orientation. I was asking them on the possible traffic junction if they will entertain underpass system, and I was also asking if their state government could be open for national government assistance for the development. Do Baltimore allow third parties for the development process? It's directed at Klaus.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure I understand all the aspects of the question, but definitely what's called P3, public-private partnership, is a big deal for government on all levels. And for example, the red line would have included a private portion that would have been done by a private entity in terms of financing, construction, design, and operations. And that is also true for public housing now. So the latest redevelopment of public housing, Perkins Homes near Fells Point, is going to be a P3 in a partnership with the housing department and private developers, in which it will become a mixed-use community. There has been discussion about privatization of water, sewer, water service especially. This goes full circle. There is a lot of insight now that privatization of utilities is not a good idea. The governor of Maryland is very high on public-private partnerships to build roadways and has big plans around Baltimore and especially Washington to build additional high occupancy lanes where people pay their way out of congestion. You don't even have to be high occupant. You can also HOT a toll lane, pay more, and then you can drive faster. And with that revenue source, he thinks that private developers would build those without the state having much to foot the bill.
Okay. The next question states, shouldn't the management of civic perception be a major tenet of regrowth? In terms of Baltimore, a reputation for high crime, poverty, and dysfunction continues to plague efforts at rebirth.
Yeah, this is one of our perennial topics, the branding, the image. The reality is that there is a lot of venture capital that comes to Baltimore now. There are a lot of international investors that have closed the door on San Francisco or in Washington, D.C. because these places have become too expensive, and they are actually looking at those second-tier and third-tier cities like Baltimore. And there is a lot of investment going on. There was also in the question somewhere something about the taxes. And the mechanism in Baltimore was that the shrinking population had to carry a higher and higher tax burden to carry the services in the city. And that has to be broken, that mechanism. The last few mayors have not increased the taxes any further, but they also have not meaningfully, just may ever so slightly decrease them. And so there is probably would be much more success if one has a really solid growth strategy to bring in additional residents, additional taxpayers, and lower the tax burden for everybody. And that would be probably the most attractive strategy to attack all problems at once. But it's a complicated topic. But I think that growth would be a targeted growth strategy would be the silver bullet if there ever was one. I didn't list it in today's presentation because it isn't really a fully embraced strategy that the city has taken.
Okay. The next question is reinvestment in housing in Baltimore in the 70s and 80s built new housing in the North and West, even in the West Baltimore, often on suburban models. Did it help?
That's difficult to answer. I would say no. The idea that you build suburban model housing in the city to compete with the suburbs, I think is just fundamentally flawed, but it has been tried until very recently. In the 70s, they built Cold Spring, which was with Moshe Safdie as the architect, a very innovative suburban type redevelopment in a green area of Baltimore at Cold Spring. And it was aborted as a innovative, creative, different type of housing than the suburbs could offer, and then continued with traditional suburban style housing. So people do live there. And I think that what the city needs to offer is really urban style living and urban solutions to it, and not suburban type solutions. The latest version of the suburban style living in the city is the uplands that used to be 1,000 units of affordable housing and has been replaced about 40% of it or 30% with suburban style housing that could just sit in any other subdivision outside Baltimore. And it is so not successful that the other 2/3 have not been continued. So if that's an answer, I mean, the people that are the developers there, they may have a slightly different answer, but that's my simple answer.
Okay, the next question states, thank you to the host and presenters. Where do you see the role of politics and public policy in tackling some of your key points of reimagining the industrial legacy city, such as being livable, for example, complete streets, leveraging the creative class? Do you think the politics and public sentiment that has continued to favor an auto-centric suburban community such as Columbia over an urban one like Baltimore City has evolved to a point that people will actually choose to live and work in the city over the suburbs? Do you think the roles of planners should include engaging more in the political process to galvanize the revitalization of the city and state? Lobbying for another pro-smart growth governor?
Yeah, yes, to all of that. I mean, one needs to look at the proportions. So Maryland is projected to grow by another 1 million or so by, I forgot, 2030, 2040, something like that. I mean, that was the projection in the turn of the century. By now, the numbers shifted a bit, but nevertheless, let's say there is 1 million in the next 30 years. And Baltimore cannot get that full million, of course. So there will be still suburban growth. But if we would capture 100,000 of that, or 150,000 is my number, that I think we have the carrying capacity to do that in the city, we would solve all our problems. So to aim for that, I think with smart growth policies should be in the interest of the suburbs and the largest city in the state of Maryland, because it is the sustainable solution to do it, and it would solve all kinds of problems. The suburbs growth is like a Ponzi scheme that is not sustainable. Once that stuff ages in the suburbs, they will not be able with their tax revenue to sustain it, and this has been shown all across the country. The US, with its incredible sprawl, is bankrupting itself because it cannot maintain all that stuff.
Okay, the next question states, any consideration of Baltimore's past, present, and future should include property taxes. Housing prices are lower in city more than suburbs, but the taxes on real estate are much higher in the city than in the suburbs. Also, public schools in the suburbs are generally more desirable. Therefore, upper middle class people live in certain suburbs. Do you propose to attract such people to move into the city? If so, how? If Baltimore suburbs weren't affordable, I would have stayed in Montgomery County, and I wouldn't be contributing to Baltimore's art museum and other cultural institutions.
Yeah, and I spoke about the tax question before, and I believe that the current administration with the new mayor, the new city council, is really engaged in the strategy that I call the livable city, and an equitable and livable city. And I think that as such, there will be, the mayor is now brand new, a growth strategy has to come out of that. There is in the equity discussion often a false alternative between, do I do something for the people that are already here, or do I do something for people to attract people coming into the city? And I think that can't be an either or. You do a lot for the people in the city, especially in those neighborhoods that have high vacancy rates and so on. If you are really managing to invest in these neighborhoods enough so that people would actually move back in there and you would eliminate vacancies and disinvestment that way, then everybody would be helped. And I believe that it's not an either or, that has to be both.
Okay, this next question can be is directed to Klaus, and this it says, can you talk about the status of mixed income housing in Baltimore? Rotterdam has a social housing corporation, women corporaties. Is there anything like that in Baltimore?
Yeah, Baltimore has still a public housing authority. And as I said before, they are building new affordable housing, but usually that's replacement housing for those units that they demolished. So they have not expanded the number of units that they offer. And those new units are mixed with other income groups. It has been found that it is not successful to build these income segregated communities. So it's a mixed use, mixed income community that they are striving for. But it's not an expansion of more affordable units, and that's a problem in the entire country. There is a huge affordable housing crisis in the entire United States. And Baltimore, ironically, in spite of so much abandonment and what one would think is lots of cheap housing, is no exception, because abandonment is not livable, and you have to have good quality, low-income housing. And on that, we are failing so far. The mechanisms are multifold. They could be inclusionary zoning, where a certain amount of development has to be affordable. There is a trust fund now for affordable housing that's collecting money, but it's never enough money in there. So on that front of building affordable housing, many cities have to gear up and ramp up their game.
Dice, would you like to comment about social housing?
Solving the housing crisis. That's no, it's a serious political topic at the moment, because the Netherlands, in general, there's enough of housing space, but a lot of the wrong houses. So because families tend to be a lot smaller, like single family households, instead of big families that we built houses for in the last like 50 years. Yeah, there's a housing shortage at the moment for like 1 million houses in all of the Netherlands. The city of Rotterdam needs to build an extra 50,000 houses in the next few decades, like 2 or 3 decades, which is a lot actually. It's a densification. It's about densification. And we do have a tradition, but there's a lot of issues also with the mechanisms we have in place to actually build affordable housing. We still have housing corporations but they used to be governmental or funded by the government to actually build affordable housing for lower and middle income households. I think the city of Amsterdam, I'm not sure what the percentage in Rotterdam is, but city of Amsterdam, around 50% of all its houses are owned by these social housing corporations. But recently until 10 years ago, they started behaving more like liberal companies. They also became privatized, more or less, and they started to become also project developers. And then 10 years ago, when we had the previous financial crisis, or when we had the financial crisis, then it turned out that a lot of these companies or housing corporations were actually behaving like a risk-taking organization. So they spent a lot of money, which was not theirs, went in debt, almost went bankrupt also, some of them. So the national government also kind of shortcutted their abilities of developing social housing because they kind of overspent. So one of the big issues is now how can the social housing corporations be put back into place with what mechanism, with what kind of funding mechanisms and what kind of policies to contribute to this housing crisis, and that's currently a big issue. And when I was just stating that it was about densification, in a lot of parts of the city of Rotterdam where they're talking about densification, so they're taking out old houses that are not technically not, you know, not sufficient anymore, also in terms of sustainability and energy performance. So they're taking out these old houses that are very often small single-family houses, and they're replacing them with very often, in terms of volume, higher density, but in terms of the amount of houses, it's actually less houses are being put back into place. So this housing issue, also in a city like Rotterdam, is not so easy to fix. It's very difficult. It's a very difficult topic. Yeah. But in general, if we talk about the mix, and that's the last thing I want to say about, let's say 45% is owned in Rotterdam by housing corporations. But I think in general, the general rule is that for every like area development, if a developer wants to add housing, then 30% of the total amount needs to be social housing. And then another part is kind of lower free market housing, and then the rest is kind of whatever he wants to develop. But there's kind of a legal mix that is being prescribed.
We have about 1 minute to wrap up the session.
Okay, I can ask the last question. Compared to Rotterdam and Baltimore, seems to me that while the former is highly invested in, the latter lacks investors' attention. Could you let us know, in your opinion, what has or is leading to that? Baltimore seems to have all necessary potential geographical traits and a strong educational institution. Yeah.
Well, that's more than one can cover in a minute, but the first sentence is just not entirely correct. There are a lot of investors that, in spite of the current angst about the future of the city because of COVID, building, if you go around in Baltimore, you see cranes and investment going on everywhere in spite of all the risks. And we hope that this continues to be the case. And I'm also very bullish in the question of Baltimore in comparison to other cities, but also in general, that I believe cities will come out of the pandemic. Whether we come entirely out of this pandemic is another question, but there's no reason why the suburbs or the countryside should come out any better than the cities. The cities have the same chances to come out and learn from this pandemic and become better than everybody else.
And Dice, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah. What can I say? Well, I don't know exactly what the success factor of Rotterdam was in terms of that people started investing in its real estate. But I think it's like a 20, 30 year long attempt and investment also by the government into new infrastructure, public facilities, new area development, and also taking the lead in a lot of these developments. So I think it's very much also like a public investment that really started this the success of the current situation. But like I said, I think it's the first kind of the bridge that is basically that's behind Magda and Christina, built by the Amsterdam-based firm UN Studio. Actually, that was really like the choice to build an iconic bridge to connect the north and the south of the city. There was a public investment that had to also really kickstart this real estate development that is still actually going on. It's still not finished, so that's 30 years in place already there. So,
thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremiah, for reading all these questions aloud. and Klaus and Thijs, of course, for addressing these concerns. So on this note, hopefully very positive for the future, we are going to wrap up this session. Klaus, kindly share your last slide of the presentation, if you mind. So thank you everybody for attending this lecture, which we hope was important for you to get to know Baltimore, or if you know the city already, to get to know it even better than before. And of course, certainly a relationship with Rotterdam, which does exist. Please note that this first lecture is the first of a several lecture series that Baltimore Rotterdam Architecture is launching. Some of them will be open to the public.